It's certain that anything which attempts to extend the kingdom of God is going to run into opposition. And this was certainly the case for Nehemiah. Despite achieving his goal of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls in just 52 days, an amazing achievement by the standards of his age, Nehemiah had faced significant opposition. Not all were best pleased with his project, and so hurdles had to be overcome. And of course, the fact that Nehemiah succeeded was in part due to his own leadership qualities, and we'll be thinking a bit more about Nehemiah's leadership ability towards the end of this morning's study. But our focus for today is on Nehemiah's enemies. Nehemiah's enemies. Now, we're going to begin then with our text. And we've actually got 2 chapters to get through. So gird your loins and focus your mind for this. We're going to begin with Nehemiah chapter 4. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, if even a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their wall of stones. Hear us, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the men of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come up and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." Also, our enemies said, "Before they know it or see it, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work." Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, "Wherever you turn, they will attack us." Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, "Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes." When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time I also said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night, so they can serve us as guards by night and workmen by day. Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when we went for water. And if you flick over then to chapter 6, the story resumes. When word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall, and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. But they were scheming to harm me. So I sent messengers to them with this reply: I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. Then the 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter in which was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it is true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem: there is now a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us confer together. I sent him this reply: nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. One day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of somebody else, who was shut up at his home. He said, let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you. But I said, should a man like me run away? Or should one like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me, because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me, so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who have been trying to intimidate me. So the wall was completed on the 25th year of Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard about this and all the surrounding nations saw it, our enemies lost their self-confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Also, in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Ara, and his son Jehoahan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds, and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. Perhaps I should just close in prayer at that point. It's taken so long to do those readings. But there really are those two chapters dealing with Nehemiah's enemies. So what I propose to do is firstly say a bit about the identity of Nehemiah's enemies. Secondly, then, we'll look at their tactics. And finally, I'll tease out some lessons, the first of which will again focus on one of Nehemiah's leadership attributes. So that's the outline. Beginning then with the identity of Nehemiah's enemies. Actually, we first meet Nehemiah's enemies back in chapter 2, but I couldn't read it as well. But there's a few verses in there which introduce us to Nehemiah's enemies. Verse 10 of chapter 2 refers to Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite. Sanballat was the governor of neighbouring Samaria. That was to the north then of Judea. Tobiah was an official, possibly even the governor of Ammon, which lay to the east of Jerusalem. And in verse 19 of chapter 2, reference is made to Geshem the Arab, the third of this troublesome trio, or what Alistair Begg calls the unholy trinity. Geshem was probably even more powerful than the others, and his domain lay to the south of Jerusalem. And then in chapter 4, verse 7, the men of Ashdod make it a quartet of enemies, with their territory lying to the west of Jerusalem. This means that in every direction of the compass, Nehemiah is surrounded by those opposed to his project to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. As verse 10 of chapter 2 states, these surrounding rulers were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Israel was surrounded by enemies. And I am tempted to say, with the writer of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. And these surrounding rulers perceived then a rebuilt Jerusalem as a threat to their own position. A weak Jerusalem suited their political and commercial interests, and so they determined that they would derail Nehemiah's project from the very outset. So that's his enemies, the identity of his enemies. What about then their tactics? And actually, from what we read today, 4 tactics really do sort of leap out from the texts. The first one is ridicule. Ridicule was famously described by Thomas Carlyle as the language of the devil. And it's to the fore in the initial response of Nehemiah's enemies to his mission. Chapter 2, verse 19 reads, "But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us." "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king? Little you, against the emperor of Persia?" And then in chapter 4, incensed that the rebuilding work has begun, the ridicule is intensified. In the presence of his associates and his army, Sanballat exclaims, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? And most of the commentators think that the idea here is, will they pray their wall back up? Will they finish in a day, mocking their supposedly unrealistic ambitions? Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are? As we in Northern Ireland might say, wise up. And Sanballat's sidekick, Tobiah, cannot help but join in, playing to the audience. What they are building, if even a fox climbed on it, he would break down their wall of stones. Well, as Don Carson points out, it would have to be some fox, for the walls Nehemiah would build were some 2.5 meters thick, 8 feet thick. This is all pure ridicule, mockery designed to wound the Judahites and deter them from pursuing the project at hand. So ridicule. The second tactic then is intimidation. As they realize that their ridicule hasn't succeeded, with the walls now already rebuilt to half their target height, Nehemiah's foes change tack. Now they use intimidation, the threat of violence. Chapter 4, verse 9, they all plotted together to come up and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. And the intimidation starts to bear fruit, for it breeds fear and discouragement amongst the Judahites. Suddenly their perspective alters. The task that they had so readily embraced, back in chapter 2, let us rebuild the wall, now seems too daunting. A defeatist mentality has started to set in. Verse 10, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. The dread of a sudden attack is palpable. And it isn't just those Jews living within Jerusalem who are affected. Those from the surrounding areas report 10 times over, a Hebraism for repeatedly, that wherever you turn, they will attack us. Nehemiah's enemies they're doing a number on Nehemiah, and he is in perilous danger of losing his workforce. However, as we'll see, Nehemiah isn't ready to give up, and through his adept leadership, the work continues to the point where the walls are rebuilt, and all that remains is for the doors to be set in the gates of the city. This then elicits a further change of tactics on the part of his enemies, and that takes us then into chapter 6. And the third tactic is then deception. Deception. Now, I do have a subdivision here, I'm afraid, because the deception really is broken down into three stages. First of all, there's this offer made of a sort of diplomatic rendezvous. Realizing that the situation has got extremely serious, Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, and their allies conspire to lure Nehemiah to a meeting in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. Now, this would require more than a day's journey for Nehemiah, but more importantly, it would take him into no man's land. For the plain of Ono was at the northwestern border between Judah and Samaria and Ashdod. The offer smelt of treachery. Likely it was a ruse designed to result in Nehemiah's kidnapping or even possibly his death. 4 times, indeed really 5 times, the overture is made, but on each occasion it is rebutted by Nehemiah. And I like what Alistair Begg says on this. Nehemiah said no to, oh no. Secondly then, there was the dispatch of hate mail. The fifth offer of a meeting is accompanied by a letter. Letters are those things that you used to send, before email and texting was invented. The contents are a claim that the rebuilding work is being done in preparation for Nehemiah declaring himself as Judah's king and staging a rebellion against Persian rule. And significantly, the letter is unsealed. That is, it was an open letter that then would be read many times on its journey to Jerusalem. So news of this purported revolt would spread like wildfire. Remember also that Nehemiah's opponents had history in getting the rebuilding work stopped by bringing an accusation of rebellion to Artaxerxes' attention. Some commentators think that Sanballat is posing here as sort of Nehemiah's concerned friend. It's Geshem and the others who are making this claim, and if only Nehemiah would meet with them, he could put these rumours to bed. More likely, Sanballat is issuing a threat that if Nehemiah continues to refuse to meet with them, he is going to see to it that Artaxerxes receives official notification that Nehemiah is up to no good. And Artaxerxes will come down on him like a ton of bricks, or maybe a ton of boulders, literally dismantling the newly rebuilt walls and dismantling Nehemiah to boot. But once more, Sanballat is foiled. And then we have the third stage of the deception, which involves the hiring of false prophets. In their desperation, Nehemiah's enemies solicit the services of Shemaiah and others like the prophetess Noadiah to come up with a cunning plan to entice Nehemiah into the Jerusalem temple, thereby discrediting his reputation. This could be because he would be viewed as a coward, holed up in the temple because he was fearing for his life. But more likely, it was intended to make Nehemiah guilty of profanity. It talks in the text about, getting him to commit a sin. If Shemaiah could lure Nehemiah into the holy place, then Nehemiah would have committed the sin of sacrilege, for no lay person was permitted to enter the inner divisions of the temple. But once again, Nehemiah sees through the artifice of his enemies. So, we've had ridicule, then intimidation, then deception, and fourthly, sedition. Nehemiah's enemies don't succeed. In chapter 6, verse 15, we're told that the rebuilding work was complete, all done in a stunning 52 days. But though they had failed to stop the rebuilding project, Nehemiah's enemies aren't finished yet. They still have one tactic up their sleeve, and that is sedition. That is the sowing of disloyalty, the fomenting of dissent with Nehemiah's rule. And it was done via family and social connections. You see, many of Judah's nobles, they're great and good, were connected to Tobiah by marriage or patronage. And these nobles continued to yield loyalty to him, Tobiah, rather than to Nehemiah. They constituted a fifth column, the enemy within, and their influence would continue to be felt in the life of Judea thereafter, especially when Nehemiah chose to terminate his first term as governor and fulfill his pledge to return to the court of Artaxerxes. And we will see that in the fifth and final talk in this series. There is a fourth talk in between. But we now arrive at this morning's three lessons. The first of which then draws upon a particular feature of Nehemiah's leadership qualities. And that is wisdom. Wisdom. Previously, we've observed that Nehemiah was a man of prayer, and secondly, a man of courage. And we talked about how those are so important in terms of leadership attributes. But Nehemiah was also a man of great wisdom and discernment. We see this in how he reacted to the various tactics of his opponents. First, he refused to be deterred by their mockery, but simply committed the project to the Lord's favour and committed his enemies to the Lord's wrath. Second, in the face of their threats of violence, he took sensible precautions. He posted guards by day and by night. He afforded special protection to the most vulnerable sections of the wall. He divided up the workforce such that while half did the labour, the other half stood guard over them. Famously, he instructed that those doing the work should themselves be armed at all times. They should each carry a trowel and a sword. He ensured that there was an effective communication system to redirect men to the likely focal point of any attack. And he ordered that the workforce remain within Jerusalem. Rather than return to the villages in the evening, they doubled up as night sentries. Third, Nehemiah was able to see through the machinations of his enemies, foiling the attempt to kidnap or kill him at Ono, or to discredit his name by taking refuge in the temple. Nehemiah was alert to danger, deciphering the wicked motives of his enemies. He was no dupe, nobody's fool. Nehemiah didn't allow his spirituality and his dependence upon prayer to deny or relegate the necessity of taking practical measures to safeguard his person, his people, and his project. And all good leaders need discernment. They all require wisdom. They need to be able to analyze situations, to assess motives, to devise strategies, and to adopt practical measures. Of course, they shouldn't be placing exclusive reliance upon their own intuition and insights. They need to pray and look to the Lord to provide wisdom from above. But leadership is not a place for fools, no matter how spiritual they might appear or claim to be. Second lesson, expect opposition. We mustn't be surprised when, as Christians or as the church, we are on the receiving end of opposition. As I said in the introduction, all true works of God will invite resistance. That resistance is ultimately inspired by Satan. As Jesus said, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. John 15, verse 20. And that opposition will come in various guises. Some of it will be verbal ridicule, mockery, jeering, put-downs. And let's not underestimate the power of the tongue. You know, we all know the children's rhyme about sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never help or never hurt me. Well, that is just tosh. Words do hurt. Sometimes words can be more wounding than even stones. Other opposition will take the form of intimidation, physical bullying, police raids, electronic surveillance, mob attacks, the threat of litigation, and so on. And it used to be that this was largely confined to the non-Western world. And whilst it's the case that such opposition is still mostly found in other parts of the globe, we do see the encroachment of intimidation into our Western context, as Christians are now condemned for proclaiming the gospel, or even prosecuted or discriminated against for standing up for traditional biblical morality on sex and gender and marriage issues. Other opposition will take the form of deception, and this is often the case with opposition from within the church. False teaching has penetrated the church, even the evangelical church. Subtle efforts are made to turn Christians away from the truth, often this being done in the name of tolerance or love. And then there's the sowing of disunity, the creation of factions, the undermining of authority. Do we not observe this all around us as churches split, as Christians dispute with one another, often over the most petty of issues or even just personality clashes? Sometimes family or national ties are exploited to erode the sense of oneness in Christ. So let's be aware that Satan's opposition is not always in the form of the roaring lion. It can also be the angel of light, the deceiver who insinuates his way into church life, wreaking havoc in his wake. Finally, confrontation is sometimes necessary. Nehemiah wasn't one for shying away from confrontation. He put the fulfilling of God's purposes ahead of any desire for a quiet life. He wasn't willing to be bought off by his opponents. He wouldn't lie down or give up. Rather, he exhibited fortitude and resolve. Indeed, not a few commentators are made a bit uneasy by some of Nehemiah's prayers regarding his enemies, for he certainly didn't mince his words or soft pedal his desire that they be put in their place. Nehemiah knew that the stakes were enormous. If he didn't overcome his opponents, then the walls of Jerusalem would remain unbuilt, and God's glory would not return to the city. And so he did what was necessary to secure success. No doubt it was at times unpleasant. No doubt it was tempting to go for the easy way out, but Nehemiah wouldn't and didn't. He dealt with his opponents as necessary, with no quarter afforded to their evil designs. And we too need to face down our enemies, not to duck confrontation, however unpleasant. Yes, we should not be aggressive. We shouldn't be spoiling for a fight. But where we are on the receiving end of opposition, whether from without or from within the church, we must resist it with all our might. Some won't like it. Some will urge that we be quiet or opt for the easy life. But that is not to follow in the footsteps of Nehemiah. Nor indeed is it to follow in the footsteps of our Lord Jesus, who, when faced with opposition, even direct opposition from Satan himself, would have no truck with compromise. So we have much to learn from Nehemiah's treatment of his enemies. Next time, we're going to resume with thinking about Nehemiah's example. But I just have a little postscript. When watching back the first talk in this series, I realized that at one point I inadvertently referred to Nehemiah as the stepson of Queen Esther, having already pointed out that King Artaxerxes was her stepson. And unfortunately, I didn't get to the editor in time before it went out. So just to be clear, Esther was the stepmother of Artaxerxes. But as far as we know, she was not the stepmother of Nehemiah.